All right, there we go. So welcome everyone. I see we have a number of participants joining. Thank you for joining Positive Women's Network's Reproductive Justice and the HIV Movement Teach-in. This is going to be a framework to guide our future, and we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. But while we're waiting for folks to join, let's go ahead and talk about a little bit of the logistics for this webinar. Next slide. So first off, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will feature the presenters and the slideshow. So as an attendee, you don't have to worry about your face being on camera. You should feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function throughout today's session. We're going to keep monitoring it. We might not respond to questions in real time, but we do have time for question and answer at the end, and we'll respond to some through using the chat function as well. We want you to be loud and proud on Twitter. So we want you to tweet us using hashtag ReproJustice is hashtag HIVJustice. And in case you want to feature PWN in your tweet, you can @USPWN to reach us. And then finally, this is going to be an interactive conversation. This is a teach-in. And I know everyone on this teach-in knows that it's really, really challenging to be interactive when you're on a webinar. And so what we're going to be doing is using the chat to try and be as together as a community as possible. So we're going to give it a shot. Elena, could you go to the next screen, please? All right, so when you see that big pink box that says drop in the chat, that is your cue to start being as vocal in the chat as you can. So to start off with, I want you all to go ahead and drop your name, your pronouns. If you have an affiliation, an organization, or something you want to share, please do that, as well as your favorite song right now. We have a running bet for how many Beyonce songs we're going to get. So I'm really excited to see what y'all drop in there. So we're going to wait here for just a couple of minutes while folks are continuing to join in. And if you're new and just joining, please go ahead and put your name, pronouns, affiliation or organization, and your favorite song right now in the chat. All right, I see a lot of people sharing. Thank you so much. All right, we see Church Girl by Beyonce, Decode by Paramore. Awesome, keep it coming, everyone. All right, I see we have had some more participants join. Thank you so much, everyone. You are joining PWN's Reproductive Justice and the HIV Movement Teach-in. We right now are checking out our interactive components. So whenever you see this big pink box that says drop in the chat, that's when I want you to start tap typing on your computer. So this time it is names, pronouns. If you have an affiliation or org, include that, and your favorite song right now so that we can start compiling a rad playlist. All right, and we're going to keep moving along. Next slide. So today's goals. When participants leave this teach-in, we're hoping that 3 things are going to be achieved. First is that you're going to have learned more about the reproductive justice framework. The second is you're going to be really able to make those connections between the reproductive framework and what it means for the HIV community. And then the last thing, because it's a PWN teach-in, we're going to leave you with opportunities to take action. So you're going to identify some opportunities that you can use to practice reproductive justice in action. And I know you see the pink box, so go ahead and drop in the chat what you hope to get out of the conversation today. Let's see, what are folks looking for? Oh, there we go. All right, folks, while you're dropping in the chat what you hope to get out of this conversation today, we're going to go to the next slide for the agenda. So first thing is the welcome. Welcome, everyone. We're here. Next up, we're going to get a grounding in reproductive justice. Then we're going to talk about reproductive justice and the HIV response. Then we're going to turn towards action and talk about reproductive justice in action, and specifically some things that PWN has done and will be doing that you can join in on. And we're going to close out with some ways for you to get involved. Next slide. We have an absolutely packed speaker lineup today. So we're very lucky to be joined by these 6 folks. First up, Nana Khanna is PWN's co-executive director, and she uses she, they pronouns. I am Kelly Flannery. Hi, everyone. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm PWN's policy director. We're also joined by Sally Thomas, who is PWN's voter engagement specialist and uses she, her pronouns. We have Elena Ferguson on board as PWN-USA's policy specialist. She uses she, her pronouns. And we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by two representatives from two really powerful PWN chapters. First up is Shannon Robinson. They are the Western Slope Outreach and Recruitment Coordinator, and they use they, she pronouns. Shannon is with PWN Colorado. And we have Myra Frank, who's with PWN Alabama. Myra is the outreach coordinator, as well as PWN's Reproductive Justice for Black Lives, RJ4BL, ambassador. She uses she, her pronouns. Shannon and Myra, a really huge thanks to the both of you for being here. Next slide. So if you're on this webinar, you might already know who PWN is, but in case you don't, PWN is the only national membership body that's led by and for women, transgender, and gender diverse people living with HIV. PWN applies a racial justice, gender justice, and economic justice lens to the HIV epidemic. And what you'll learn throughout this presentation / teach-in is that those three forms of justice, racial, gender, and economic justice, all fall within the umbrella of reproductive justice. We envision a world where all women living with HIV can live long, healthy, dignified lives free from stigma and discrimination. PWN really brings a root cause analysis to the HIV epidemic. And what that means is that we recognize that its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities is actually a symptom of the larger structural injustices. Things that include but aren't limited to racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and stigmatizing attitudes towards communities vulnerable to acquiring HIV. And so we really use our power to try and make our vision a reality. And some of the ways that we do that is through leadership building, specifically focusing on uplifting the leadership and power of communities most impacted by the HIV epidemic. We do issue-based and electoral organizing. We do policy analysis and advocacy in order to mobilize advocates to take action and impact the policies that are going to impact their lives. We also push for narrative change through things like strategic communications that really centers the perspectives of the folks who are going to be most impacted by policy decisions. Next slide, please. All right, from here, I'm going to turn it over to Sally Thomas to give us a little grounding and introduction to reproductive justice.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks everyone for being here today. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is just a little background about the lineage of reproductive justice. So the reproductive justice movement came into its own in 1994. Of mostly white women gathered at a conference in Chicago to hear about the Clinton administration's proposal emphasized reproductive health care in an attempt to head off Republicans were concerned. There was fibroid screenings or STI tests, no choice reproductive things like income, housing, and the criminal justice system. So 12 Black women leaders gathered in a hotel room to discuss how to address these disparities. On this slide, you can see some of their names listed, all of the founding mothers listed, and then also a few of the other amazing RJ warriors that we've been privileged to be in movement with, including Monica Simpson, Dazon Dixon Diallo, Dion Haywood, Juanita Williams, and so many more. We would love if you could drop some of your too. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we have the reproductive justice framework, which basically says that every individual has the human right to decide if and when they will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. and also to decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending pregnancy. Also to parent the children they already have with the necessary social support in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the state. Ultimately, reproductive justice is about bodily autonomy and to be free from all forms of reproductive oppression. In the chat, let us know what RJ means to you. I can pass to Kelly.
All right. All right. So I am looking in the chat. I would love to see, what does reproductive justice mean to you? As we continue to go forward with this presentation, this is a question that I want you to keep thinking about, and whether maybe reproductive justice and what it means changes for you throughout it. So first off, I want to say is reproductive justice is intersectional. Intersectional is a long and technical word. It's a word that was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, but as a concept, it's really been a core component of the reproductive justice movement since it began, and probably before then as well. So you can think of intersectionality as the ways that systems interact, especially systems of inequality and oppression. So that's whether it's based off of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, or other forms of discrimination. When these systems of oppression do intersect, they create unique dynamics and can multiply harms. So one of the ways to think of it is, let's say there is a Black trans woman who has a disability. You can't ask that person to exist at one point as a Black person, as one point as a woman, as one point as a trans woman, and at another point as a person with a disability, because all of those facets of her identity intersect and help to create who she is. And part of the problem that Sally was talking about, specifically with the reproductive rights movement, as it was led by primarily cis, white, middle-class women, is that there was a lack of intersectionality. It really centered more of whiteness. And reproductive justice movement came and pushed really, really hard against that framing. And one of the things that you might think about when you think about reproductive justice that a lot of people do is abortion. Abortion access is a crucial component of reproductive justice, but reproductive justice also looks beyond a singular focus on abortion access. We're going to talk through three different things. So you might hear this, you might see this long term. It's SRHRJ. If someone could put that in the chat for me, SRHRJ. What that means is sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. Those are actually all three different things. So first off, reproductive health. Reproductive health really focuses on services. So you can think of something like expanding access to preventative care, or perhaps like expanding access to culturally competent, trans-inclusive healthcare services. It really cares about getting the people the services that they need. Reproductive rights, on the other hand, focuses on protecting legal rights to reproductive services. Reproductive rights, sometimes we do associate directly with keeping abortion legal. One of the problems with keeping abortion legal, as you know, after the Dobbs decision, is incredibly important, but it's also a ground. Just because abortion is legal does not mean that everyone has access to it. When Roe was still the law of the land, still not everyone could access abortions because legality isn't everything, though it is an important fight. Reproductive justice pushes us beyond the concentration on legality of abortion, and instead it focuses on movement building and intersectionality. So reproductive justice really emphasizes the ways that race, ethnicity, class, gender identity, sexual orientation shape reproductive healthcare experiences, services, and policy. It is an expansive and holistic approach to someone's reproductive life cycle. Reproductive justice is also grounded in human rights and social justice. So it really exists with the recognition that true control over someone's reproductive life and their future requires access to specific community-based resources. This includes things like high-quality healthcare, safe and affordable housing and education, economic security, a healthy environment, clean drinking water, food, sanitation, and a secure safety net that's ready and accessible for times when resources aren't there that you need. So safe and dignified reproductive health care, childbirth, childcare, and parenting are all impossible without access to these resources. So you can't focus on one without fighting for all of the others. Reproductive justice also at its core challenges white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racism, as well as transphobia, and a number of other isms. Next slide. So to put it really plainly, really simply, sexual and reproductive justice will exist when all people have the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, bodies, sexuality, and families for ourselves and our communities. And I really want to highlight here all people. I said before that reproductive justice is grounded in human rights. And human rights means that we have rights simply because we exist as human beings. It's nothing that the state grants or can take away, although they can violate your human rights. They can't take them away because they are yours for the fact of being human. They are universal rights that are inherent to everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, sex, gender, gender identity, and for PWN, we really care about healthcare status. So all people includes people living with and communities structurally vulnerable to HIV. Next slide. So this is from Sister Song, good credit where brilliant credit is due. Reproductive justice recognizes that the ability of any person to determine what happens to their body is directly related to what's happening in their community. Just think of what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now. The access to clean drinking water is so clearly determined by and has a deep connection to someone's decisions about what happens to their body. If they can't choose to have clean drinking water because the state has failed them, that is a reproductive justice issue. Reproductive justice recognizes that human rights protections or violations will determine an individual's ability to exercise self-determination. The state has a responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. It often fails to meet that standard. And that has a really deep impact on what someone's able to do in their own life and community. And finally, reproductive justice recognizes that we have to work with other social justice movements. Their struggle is connected to ours in order to build a new movement to save our lives and those of our families and our communities. Next slide. Okay. So this is a very long slide. I'm not going to read it all because we simply don't have time on this presentation. But what I want you to take away from this is we're going to talk about reproductive oppression, and a trigger warning that this conversation is going to involve sexual violence. And so if that's something you're not comfortable hearing about, please do turn off your computer for a little bit and then come back, or mute yourself or mute us. So first off, what is reproductive oppression? It is the regulation, exploitation against people's bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproductive capacities. It is a form of violence that's used as a strategy to control people and entire communities. So the fact that Black and Brown people make up a majority of new HIV diagnoses in the US, and specifically in the US South, which Elena is going to get to in a little bit, that's a symptom of policies, both in the past and current, that perpetuate reproductive oppression. So think of things like the intentional failure to resource and support Black and Indigenous communities, while at the same time over-policing and over-incarcerating those exact same communities. We have examples of reproductive oppression that happened in the past that still have impact today. So think about rape, sexual violence, contraceptive and gynecological experiments that were forced on people who were enslaved. That is not something that just exists in the past, but has resonating impacts. And we see it today in something like the forced sterilization of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women, people with disabilities, people who are incarcerated, and people living with HIV. If you think that that's a policy that exists in the past, you need to give that a second thought, because between 2006 and 2010, 2 California state prisons alone had sterilized 148 incarcerated women without their knowledge or consent. We also have really clear policies today that are clear examples of reproductive oppression against trans folks. So things like restricted or lack of access to trans inclusive reproductive health care. If you all have been looking in the news, you've seen that states are passing laws to restrict access to gender-affirming care. It also happens in the way that we talk about abortion. Sometimes folks talk about abortion as though it's a thing that only matters to women. That is not the case. Sometimes trans men, gender nonconforming people, gender diverse people need access to abortion, and by excluding them from the conversation, we invisibilize them. Other examples are condoms as evidence policies. So these are policies that police use and prosecutors use, where basically if someone has a lot of condoms on them, they can be accused of a sex work related offense. So this deprives someone of their ability to protect themselves by using condoms. And it also allows the police an extra leeway in just stereotyping and targeting people for sex work related convictions. There's many more in here, and we're going to talk about more going forward. So I want you to think, as this conversation keeps going, what are examples of reproductive oppression that you've seen? You should feel free to drop them in the chat as the conversation goes forward, and I'm going to pass it over to Elena.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Elena Ferguson. I'm the policy specialist at Positive Women's Network, and I'm going to talk to you all a little bit today about reproductive oppression in the South. So the South is, a unique place. It's an often forgotten place in terms of, for example, funding for RJ orgs, or just forgotten in terms of people tend to think of it as a place that's just natural, like the conditions within the South just occur naturally. Like, for example, this water crisis in Jackson, like people might think that that's just supposed to happen because it's Mississippi. But in reality, the conditions within Southern states are due to, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, state-sanctioned violence these forces are kind of pressing upon them. So here's just like a couple of examples of reproductive oppression in the South. The reproductive exploitation and dual labor of people who are enslaved. So in terms of, having children, people who are enslaved, having children while also doing that labor, as well as like doing the actual labor, the work that they were forced to do, forced sterilizations, and AKA, they used to call these types of things Mississippi appendectomies. Fannie Lou Hamer, who's pictured here on my right, she had one of these. So a lot of women would go to the doctor for standard procedures and would come out being sterilized without their consent, without their knowledge. This kind of thing still happens today, like Kelly mentioned, in prisons, as well as, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a ICE detention center in Georgia where they were doing forced sterilizations on some of the folks who were there. And that's really has a long historical history as well. The South in particular has high maternal and infant mortality rates, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. The South has a high population of conservative legislatures, and structural racism just kind of teeming within it. A lot of instances of abstinence-only sex education, so lack of access there, and a failure to separate church and state. So here's just some other examples. After the Dobbs decision, abortion has just been, and I'm sure, in a lot of our minds. So this is just a map of the current abortion bans in the country. So as you can see, there is most of the southern states have total bans, or at least some type of ban. And that, is no coincidence. I just read a study that came out a couple of weeks ago out of Tulane University that said that the states with abortion bans also had high rates of maternal mortality as well. So there's a correlation in that. So yeah, just the South clearly is continuing to oppress its citizens, and it's by design. Here's another map showing the maternal mortality rates as well. So as you can see, again, not surprisingly, the South has particularly high rates of maternal mortality, particularly in Georgia as well. And finally, Here's another map of states that have expanded Medicaid. As you can see, most states in the South have failed to expand Medicaid, making it that much harder for folks in the South to access all forms of healthcare, but particularly reproductive healthcare as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Nana for this section.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of my colleagues who've been presenting so far, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'm Nana. Again, I come to this work as a woman living with HIV, and I'm also privileged to be co-executive director of Positive Women's Network. And I'm going to talk a little bit about reproductive oppression as it impacts people living with HIV, and also what the HIV community has and sort of maybe has not done historically to address this issue. So just a few examples, and this is something that Positive Women's Network has been working on, since our founding. These are a few quotes from some of our members that came in through a survey that we conducted on sexual and reproductive health rights and freedom. So, you can kind of read these quotes for yourself, but you'll see folks are talking about not getting, people living with HIV, not getting advice about reproductive health. Not being talked to about sex, about their sex lives, right? Or even like contemplating having children. So that part of SRHJ, sexual rights also are important. And that's something that we don't talk a lot about in the context of people living with HIV. We actually do have the right to sexual pleasure and erotic pleasure and safe, sex lives where we are safe and free from violence. And these are pieces that are often unaddressed by providers. Oftentimes clinicians and providers will ask, are you using a condom, but nothing else really about your sex life. They're just sort of looking at us as potential vehicles or vessels of transmission, which is really a way of undermining our sexual and reproductive freedom by violating our right to information, to counseling, and to all of that. For folks of trans experience, there are some particularly types of egregious violations that occur, like, for example, not being advised about their options to protect their future reproductive potential while going through any type of medical transition process. The failure to uptake U equals U information, the U equals U science, is also a violation of our sexual and reproductive rights because it denies us the right to that information and to make informed decisions. There are a few more examples mentioned here. People living with HIV can be criminalized for breast and chest feeding while living with HIV. That is also a reproductive justice violation. So these are just a few examples. We can go to the next slide, please, and the next section. We'd love to hear from y'all about what are your thoughts on how different types of reproductive oppression impact cis and trans women, trans men, gender non-binary folks living with HIV specifically. So tell us what you think in the chat, and we're going to move on to the next slide. So just thinking a little bit about reproductive justice and the HIV response. Next slide, please. It's important to name that, as was pointed out earlier, there are many HIV reproductive justice organizations and leaders, especially Black, cis, and trans women, who have been connecting these dots for decades. So, for example, Women with a Vision, Sister Love, Sister Song, Afia Center. There are so many organizations that have been doing the work at the forefront of these intersections of really looking at reproductive justice and HIV. But unfortunately, the HIV community often has really failed us in terms of taking this on in a serious way, a systematic and structural way, and even using language around reproductive justice, reproductive rights, sexual rights has not really been part of the mainstream HIV discourse. It has always fallen on and been the labor of Black women and women of color to uplift these conversations, these policy priorities consistently through the 4+ decades of the HIV response. Next slide, please. Globally, we know that there are many forms of reproductive oppression that are impacting women living with HIV. And it's not that different here in the US, impacting women and trans folks living with HIV. So forced sterilizations, coercion, we've heard from many members who have experienced non-consensual sterilization, coercion, coercion around abortion or pregnancy options, pregnancy choices, decisions about parenting, things like that. This continues to this day. Next slide, please. So PWN has been working to address this at a policy level for a very long time. In fact, in the very first iteration of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, which came out under President Obama in 2010, we had already written and submitted recommendations to the Obama-Biden transition team back in 2008 that uplifted some of the priorities around sexual and reproductive freedom for people living with HIV. When the strategy actually came out, we were really disappointed to see that many of the concerns we had uplifted, which connected to reproductive justice, including freedom from violence, meaningful involvement of impacted communities, a focus on healthcare that really met our full needs. None of that was really integrated into the strategy. And so in the very first iteration of that strategy, we did a gender audit, like basically gave it a report card and gave it a generous C+. Next slide, please. So we're now 3 strategies later, 3 strategies into the response. The most recent version of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy was released on World AIDS Day 2021 under the leadership of President Biden and the current White House Office of National AIDS Policy. It mentions reproductive health care for people living with HIV 2 times. Here are the quotes. So, this is some useful language that talks about the need to co-locate services, including reproductive and other healthcare services for people living with HIV, with other types of services. It also talks about the importance of reproductive health and transition-related care for people of trans experience. This is critically important, but it doesn't go far enough. And in fact, the federal implementation plan, which is actually how the strategy gets implemented, which was just released about 2 weeks ago, has exactly 0 actions that specifically relate to advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights of people who are already living with HIV. That means that there is some language about sexual health in the federal implementation plan. It is all about integrating HIV testing into sexual health settings, HIV prevention services into sexual health settings. There is literally nothing about addressing the sexual and reproductive health care and rights needs of the estimated 1.2 million people already living with HIV in the United States and who expect to be here after we've, quote, ended the epidemic, right? So this is part of our basic quality of life. This is part of our basic human dignity. And yet the federal response continues to fail us. And not only does the federal response continue to fail us, unfortunately, many of our partners and allies in the field, other policy advocates, institutions with a lot more resources who are doing a lot of legislative advocacy and things like that also have continued to fail us in uplifting these types of concerns that we've been raising consistently for now 14 years. Next slide, please. So, like I said, PWN has been doing this work in all kinds of different ways for a long time, and many of our partners on the ground in the field have been doing this as well. But these are just a few examples. In 2013, we produced the first ever that I'm aware of report on, and this is about like a 70-page report called Sexuality, Romance, and Reproductive Freedom for Women Living with HIV in the United States. This included a review of the literature. It included surveys of conducted with more than 179 women living with HIV, and it included some other components as well. It was written and authored and analyzed entirely by women living with HIV. And we invite you to look at and read this report, but it's important to name that, it took like a year to put this together and we're still talking about the same things. This was released in 2013. We also, with partners at Prevention Access Campaign and others, have been working to uplift concerns about why the U=U messaging has been so difficult to get to take hold, right? So finally, we're making progress on U=U being generally accepted as science. But in practice, in the clinics, when you go to see your providers, when you go to talk to your clinician or your case manager or your social worker, are they really re-educated about the U=U science and the implications of that for our sexual lives and our reproductive lives? And this is an excerpt from an article that I published at the end of 2017, basically basically framing that our theory is that this basically comes down to racism, misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia. It's basically this idea that people living with HIV cannot be trusted to make good decisions, right? That's what's at the bottom of not giving us the information we have the right to make decisions about our own sexual lives and our medical decisions. Next slide, please. So again, many of our, quote, partners in the field have consistently not been allies on reproductive justice. And this is one of the reasons we feel like it's important to have this conversation, because look at where we are today, right? So back in 2016, right after the election that happened, I think we all saw the writing on the wall and what was coming for our communities, right? We knew that the previous administration was going to come for queer and trans folks, for immigrants, for BIPOC communities, and certainly for things like reproductive freedom. They've been very clear about that. So when we brought that up as a concern at the major federal policy table at a post-election meeting, we were told that it was not good for HIV funding, for HIV organizations to ally with organizations like Planned Parenthood. It could be bad, it could have consequences. And so our partners organizations in the states that do lobbying in their state legislatures on HIV issues and HIV funding and appropriations, we're not going to throw down with Planned Parenthood to protect abortion rights. That is directly what we were told. Next slide, please. So, I think we can see where we are today. These are just a couple of other resources that I don't think I have time to talk about. We'll drop the links into the chat for you. PWN has put forth a framework for bodily autonomy. This is something we released a couple of years ago, kind of linking a lot of different forms of freedom that relate to our bodies. Next slide, please. We also have worked a lot in partnership with Positively Trans and amazing folks at Transgender Law Center to put forth some frameworks for trans-centered reproductive justice. This is something that is commonly missing from the conversation. And, Kelly laid out some examples of oppression that impact trans communities and reproductive justice. But even a very common one, an easy one for all of us to correct, is just not using language that frames abortion or reproductive freedom as solely an issue for cisgender women, right? This is a simple intervention that we can make to understand that when we talk about reproductive justice, we're talking about reproductive justice for everybody of any gender. Next slide, please. So I think I probably don't need to talk about where we are today. We know where we are today. Roe has fallen. And that 6 years of work that we could have been doing, that the HIV community could have been engaged in to help protect Roe and help protect abortion access in the state and fight back on things like trigger laws that have now gone into effect. Because let's be clear, HIV organizations and community have a lot of political capital in the states. They've been building it for many decades, but it didn't get used to protect abortion access in the states. And so here now we have basically a situation where Roe has fallen and rights have been decimated. And that is just a terrible shame. And part of it is because folks have been really short-sighted and not understanding how protecting reproductive freedom links to a lot of other freedoms. So now we see the same attorney who basically set up the case for SB 8 in Texas, the Texas abortion restriction law, who established that case, also set up the case for now PrEP availability to be considered a violation of religious freedom using the same type of legal theory. And we know that they're going to be coming for contraceptive access and all types of other things. Next slide, please. So, you can kind of see what the state of abortion access is across the country. It is pretty dire. We are fighting back. A lot of you are fighting back. We're grateful to be in movement with all of you. Am I on my last slide? Next slide, please. So we'd love to hear from you. What are your ideas about how the HIV community can better show up as allies and accomplices for reproductive freedom? And next, we're going to talk about what some of that work is looking like on the ground. And I know that a lot of folks were really interested in hearing that piece from your introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. All right, so what's up next? We're going to be connecting the dots, reproductive justice in action. Next slide, please. So RJ in action. What is our ultimate goal? liberation. I really hope you check out that bodily autonomy framework that Nana put into the chat, or Barb put into the chat. It's really important because really our goal is that, you know, people should have control over what does and does not happen to their bodies and in their communities. So we're working to change hearts and minds. Abortion is often treated as a partisan issue, but it is not. Abortion is a healthcare issue. Abortion is a human rights issue. And we recognize that political divisions are not inevitable. Political divisions are created in order to separate us and to make it harder for us to collectively organize and use our power to transform systems. So we're working to challenge systems of power and ideologies from their roots. Otherwise, we all lose. Think of it like a weed. You have to get it from the root in order to stop the harm. So we're really working to together build power, change culture, and transform systems. We're trying to build a stronger cross-movement, progressive base, community, and movement. I'm sure you all remember that sister song slide that talked about how we need to work with other movements in solidarity with them because our issues are all connected. PWN is trying to create sustainable long-term solutions, and that requires changing who's in power and how power is held. We'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that going forward. And some of the ways that we do that is we offer folks a place to plug in and get active. We're looking to expand the number of people who consider PWN their political home and who's ready to throw down for us in favor of reproductive justice, bodily autonomy, and abortion without barriers. We're working to create a stronger foundation for LGBTQ rights and liberation, racial equity, sex worker rights, and HIV resources and policies. Next slide. So now I want you to go ahead and drop in the chat. What has stopped you from organizing and mobilizing for reproductive justice? Be honest here. I also know that there are a lot of people on the slide on this presentation who maybe have been organizing for reproductive justice. If that's you, feel free to drop in what has encouraged you to mobilize for reproductive justice. I'll let you choose the way you want to deal with that. Next slide, please. All right, so there is a lot to talk about here. PWN has been doing a lot of really deep reproductive justice work. The first thing I'll note is that we've been training HIV advocates and leaders just like yourself on the reproductive justice framework, right like we're doing today. We did that with the Colorado chapter as well, and we've done it with our members and base over the years. We've also launched our Ready, Set, Repeal campaign. So this is led by Health Not Prisons Collective, of which PWN is one member. HNP is longtime collaborators that are led by and accountable to communities most affected by HIV criminalization in the United States. And really, we came together to work because we are all united against the use of policing, prosecution, and imprisonment in public health crises. And we're committed to the abolition of the carceral state, including mass incarceration. And so in that vein, we launched the Ready, Set, Repeal campaign. So the idea of this campaign is that we are really trying to push for the House of Representatives and eventually the Senate to pass the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act. Representative Barbara Lee first introduced the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act in 2011. It is still stuck in the US House of Representatives after a decade. And all of the time, meanwhile, people living with HIV are being subjected to state violence, discriminated against, policed, surveilled, and incarcerated. We're fed up and we're done waiting. And so what we've done is created a toolkit for you, as well as we made a campaign launch video. I also want you to look out for September 22nd when we'll have our day of action. We've also created constituency-led policy recommendations. We already talked a little bit about the bodily autonomy framework. I want to talk for a second about PWN's RAD policy agenda. Our policy priorities were developed with PWN members after many listening sessions. I believe it took over a year to get everything together. And we really chose our policy priorities strategically in order to fill the gaps that we saw in the landscape, including places where we thought that there were opportunities to lift up the voice of people living with HIV and to lift up racial justice, gender justice, and economic justice. So our main priority areas here are universal healthcare, economic justice, sexual and reproductive health rights and justice, ending criminalization, trans rights, safety and justice, and ending violence against women living with HIV. We also do a lot of leadership development. We have the RISE, which stands for Resist, Inspire, Sustain Through Education program, which we host in collaboration with the Transgender Strategy Center to train, prepare, and coach trans women of color living with HIV to be certified PWN trainers. We have our PWN Policy Fellowship, and we have our Reproductive Justice for Black Lives Ambassadors program, which I am going to stop now and go to the next slide. And I'm actually going to invite Myra to come onto the screen. We're going to talk a little bit about the amazing work that Alabama has been doing. So welcome, Myra.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Myra Franks, and I live in rural Alabama. Excuse me. It's a small community, which the whole county is about, it's less than 17,000 people. And people here, especially people living with HIV, they move out because these services are not that good. There's a lot of stigma attached to HIV. Right now, what we're doing, I am in PWN as an outreach coordinator, and we are engaging in voting registration. We believe that voting can really make a difference. We could help get people in who could help change policies, at least get something different. We have legislators who have been here for over 20 years and nothing's changing. September 20th is National Voter Registration Day, and we're planning events around that in our communities. We live in different parts of Alabama, so we're kind of doing our own thing so we can try to get the word out about how important voting is. And we realize that that's the way to make changes, to speak out to legislators, to educate people. You talked about education, especially sex education in the schools. It's just, Alabama is so far behind in everything, it seems like. Infant mortality, Alabama's like number 3 on the list, probably right there next to Mississippi, in the numbers, and with education and legislators who will back educating the people and having the funding available to take care of these issues that are prevalent in our communities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Myra. I would love one last word for you. So like in a word or two, what does reproductive justice for Black lives mean to you?
Reproductive justice, I know that there was always something there, but I did not have a name for it. So it's reproductive justice. And that's having the right to making the choice about myself, my body, my family, the way I live, the place that I live. People in marginalized communities, they end up kind of grouped together by railroad tracks and other places where people wouldn't live if they had a choice. That's a good way to say it, I guess.
I love it.
Yeah, so.
Thank you so much, Myra. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to you and the Alabama chapter for your fantastic work for reproductive justice.
Yes, it is my pleasure to be here. My pleasure.
All right, next slide, please. Right, so another example of RJ in action is PWN is organizing for reproductive freedom. We do that through Get Out the Vote campaigns, among other ways. We recognize that voting is one tool in the toolbox to change systems. And so we've been educating, mobilizing, and turning out voters since 2018. We reach thousands of folks through our Canvas operations and phone banks. And we use this and other issue-based organizing efforts in order to nurture new leaders and to pay folks. So important that we pay folks for our time in order to advocate on issues that directly impact them. One of our chapters that is doing that amazing work is Colorado. And so here I'm going to, next slide, turn it right over to Shannon. Shannon, you are still muted.
Now, can you hear me, Kelly?
Yes, perfect. Got you.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Shannon. I use they, she pronouns. I'm the Western Slope, Colorado coordinator. I've been with PWN since 2018, been throwing down. I live in a county of about 160,000 folks. It's the largest place between basically Salt Lake and Denver, and we have no provider for abortion services. And so one of the things that we have done is we were really fortunate in making phone calls to folks 2 weeks before the leak dropped from SCOTUS. And we have been having conversations with these folks since 2018 pretty regularly during election seasons. This year, we decided that we would pivot on a dime, really away from what we were thinking and to abortion justice and abortion rights. And so we've been having conversations between 5 to 20 minutes with folks because we know that deep conversations can change people's minds on how they feel about abortion. And we're learning so many things from our folks. So many people had no one to talk to about any of this. So many people had no one to share how they were feeling about what's going on. And so we've had conversations to change minds, deep canvas, knock on doors, pivoted from voter education to abortion access ahead of our primary, got people out for the primary, and gave our folks an opportunity to learn more about what's going on through a teach-in, not only here on the Western Slope, but in Denver. And we've worked very hard for over a week to meet with partners, have lemonade socials, knock doors, call people, and talk about what repro rights can look like, what abortion rights can look like, and pledge for body autonomy. We're building a base of supporters, and we'll keep engaging them through our legislative session this year. In 2020, we helped defeat Proposition 115, which was absolutely amazing, but we can expect that we don't get to rest. We've got to continue to do this and keep talking to our folks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Shannon, and thank you to the Colorado chapter for all of the work that you've been doing as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we get on to actions. I hope you all are revved up and excited to get out there and fight for reproductive justice and fight for abortion access for anyone who needs it. We have a little list of what you can do. The first is make sure that you're taking leadership from, supporting, and if you're able, donate to, and really elevate Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led reproductive justice organizations, as well as local abortion funds that help to get people access to the care that they need. Be explicit and specific about your support for abortion and abortion access. What does this mean? Don't use euphemisms. Some folks say choice, but it's okay. Say abortion, shout it out. We are trying to undermine the stigma of abortion care. Sign the pledge for reproductive freedom. Shannon just mentioned this. This is a way that you can indicate to PWN that you support reproductive freedom, you support abortion access, and you are ready to throw down with us. We will reach out to those lists as more opportunities become available. So we need to know that you're in the fight with us, and you can do that. Show us that by signing up. And then finally, we want you to volunteer to make calls or knock doors to protect abortion access with PWN this election cycle. If you're in Pennsylvania, Colorado, or Texas, we can get you on the doors, depending on how close you are to where our chapters are mobilizing. Even if you're not, you can make calls in order to actually talk to voters and have those meaningful conversations that Shannon was talking about. Next slide, please. All right. Now I want to hear from you. So we've shown a couple of ways that you can bring your repro justice work into your advocacy. And now I want you to drop it into the chat. What are you planning to do? What are the actions that you're going to take in support of reproductive justice? And while we're doing that, our very next slide is going to be questions. We have about 6 minutes left, more like 5 so that we can have a minute for wrapping up. So if anyone has any questions, you should feel free to go ahead and raise your hand now. using the raise your hand function, and we can unmute you. So we did it. Everyone is an expert on reproductive justice and the HIV movement, and I love you all for that. Oh yes, we got some people who are signing the pledge. Continue to make people uncomfortable speaking about abortion as healthcare. I see someone who's going to join us on some phone banks. Yes, this is amazing, everyone. And remember, share the pledge with your friends and family as well, so they get linked in and can find out opportunities like this as well. Great. And so next slide, please. Okay, this is just a reminder of our big next step asks, and those are to sign that pledge for reproductive freedom, share it with your friends, your colleagues, your people, whoever it is that you think might be interested in it. Volunteer to make calls with us, knock doors, protect abortion access with PWN. This election cycle, we also know that this fight is not going to be over this election cycle. PWN is here for the long term, and we will be fighting for reproductive freedom for the long term. We want you in that fight with us. Next slide. And we want to hear how we did. So our amazing training director, Barb, has created an evaluation for you to fill in. What, in other words, is such a trigger? Oh, okay. I think that, yeah, Mary, did you mean that, like, why is abortion such a trigger word for some folks? Why they don't like to say it out loud? I think that you answered it yourself. Abortion is abortion. Beautiful. And so go ahead. We have a couple of minutes left. We have 3 minutes left. So take the survey. Let us know how we did. Be honest. We want to know how we can do better and what we did well at, so we can keep doing it. And then next slide. So we just wanted to thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of Nana, me, Elena, Sally, we have our emails up here. You can also sign up for updates at www.pwnusa.org and follow us at USPWN. And before we close out, I'm going to hand it back over to our co-executive director, Nana Khanna, for some final words.
Thank you so much. Yes, we will share these slides with everybody who is registered for the webinar. We'll send an email with this follow-up, the slides, as well as the evaluation. So you can have the resources that were shared in the slides as well. Thank you all for being here. Stay with us in this struggle. This is the long game. And I think, as you know, as Kelly articulated so well, we're really clear that the fight to protect abortion is the fight for racial justice. It is the fight for trans liberation. It is the fight to make sure that our communities are safe and secure and housed and fed, and that school curriculums are what they need to be, and that our kids are getting what they need, and that there's safety in our communities and in our playgrounds. So there is no disconnection between these issues, right? All of our destinies are intertwined. Abortion is something they have specifically come after, and we have to push back. And we have the opportunity to push back, right? Like, so while abortion is being decimated, there are also states that have expansion of abortion and protections on the ballot this fall. That's also going to be the case next year. There's going to be threats to abortion, and there's going to be countermeasures to expand and protect abortion. And this fight is going to be state by state. It is also a fight that happens in our with our, at our dining tables, at our Thanksgiving tables, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. Everything that we can do makes a difference. Just like we fight to destigmatize HIV, we can fight to destigmatize issues like abortion. And so just really want to encourage folks to take whatever actions you can in any space you can to think about what we can do to really protect reproductive freedom, protect reproductive justice, and ensure that communities that are most directly impacted and most directly harmed are always at the table. There's no disconnection between reproductive justice and meaningful engagement of our communities as well, right? So thank you all so much. We're in this for the long haul. Do sign up for updates on our website. We'll continue to keep you in the loop about other things that are upcoming, what you can do in your local state, in your local region. If there's an action coming up in your state legislature, we will let you know. And you can mobilize on that as well. So thank you all. We'll see you soon. Check out our resources.